All right, Floodfill. Man. All right. One of my favorite groups of nodes in Substance Designer, without a doubt. When I eventually do my ill-advised Substance Designer node tier list ranking system, this is immediately in the astounding category. Easy S tier, wonderful group of nodes. It enables so much interesting stuff. We're going to get into it all today. We're going to leave a couple out because they're going to be part of something more down the line. It's a bit more interesting. But really, it just allows you to enable a bunch of different types of data extraction and interesting layering effects. On the left, this is basically just a tile generator plus a bunch of flood fills to get all of this. Those interesting cuts, the slopes of the tiles, like the damage. This does all sorts of awesome stuff. It's really, really cool. On the right is my material from the height mask extract video. And this is right at the point in the production of the graph where all the flood fill hit. And you can see it does a lot of work. It's really, really cool, enables a ton of stuff. I'm excited. It's going to allow us to unlock a bunch of stuff in the future where we want to do some more interesting tutorials. We need to know Floodfill. So let's get to the graph. All right, so the first thing we should do here is just talk about Floodfill and how it works. So if you search in your, I'm just hitting tab to bring up the search, you can find them in your library as well, which I'm covering right now. You'll see this Floodfill node, and then you have a whole whack of other extra stuff underneath it. The way this works is that this initial Floodfill node, you can sort of consider to be the primer for all the other nodes. So this guy takes in a black and white mask and he outputs a bounding box, which can be plugged in to all of your various other Floodfill nodes, so random grayscale, whichever you'd like. All right, so this guy takes a Floodfill input and he'll generate some random grayscale values for us. So what gets plugged into this is a black and white mask. There are some things you have to be aware of. If you just plug in a white square, you're just getting UV coordinates for the entire, essentially UV coordinates for the entire sheet. But if you make it smaller, right, it gets its own UV coordinates. More interestingly, if we have multiple, so I'll tile this, right, and I'll offset it so that they're all in the middle. Each of these guys get their own coordinates. And you'll see that in the Floodfill to random grayscale, it's given each of those islands a random grayscale value. This is super cool. And this is just the random grayscale. There's all sorts of other ones that are way more cool. So the thing to think about is that you're feeding this a black and white mask. Each separate island is going to get its own ID, essentially, is a way you can think of it. What's really cool is it also carries over tile borders. So even though these islands extend over the edge of the tile, I'm pressing space to display them. You can preview your tiling in the 2D viewport by pressing space. Even though they cross over, the Floodfill understands that they're the same circle. So you see that this circle and this circle receive the same value, even though they cross the boundaries, right? It's clever enough to understand that those are the same island. You don't have to do this on really discrete shapes like the circle. But what you'll notice, right, if I just scan a cloud and I have a couple different islands like this, as long as they're contiguous, meaning that there's some way, think about a maze, right? As long as you can go from one shape to the other through an area of white, they will all receive the same value in the Floodfill. Right, so all these guys get their own little ones. This huge shape gets all one big one. But as I scan it more and they become separate, they become more and more discrete, right? Become their own things. So you don't need to run this on just like big, obvious, specific shapes. You can run it down really small to noises, as long as it's an appropriately matched noise. You can't do this to all things, right? Because if it's just a blurry noise, these are all going to get, this is all one big island for the most part. All these guys get random grayscales, but that's about it. Whenever you have one tile that extends the entire length of your texture tile, you get this error in the Floodfill, which you can get rid of later if you need to. But there's limited use to this. This is sort of what you're using it mostly for, assigning different random values, especially to tiles. So a good example of this, I have this tile random I set up, and we're going to use it to apply, we're going to use Floodfill here to apply a bunch of different values to this to achieve a bunch of kind of varied effects. So a lot of times what people will do with a tile generator is do all of their random luminance and stuff in here. I don't like doing this. Right, so here's all, you can see these guys all have some random height, right? Because they all have random luminance. I would much rather, in almost all situations, there are exceptions, but in nearly every situation I can think of, I would rather do all of this stuff afterwards, separate from the tile generator. I find it easier to control. Things are more consistent. I can run bevels before them. I don't need to have random height and then try to figure out the bevel and then combine them. I don't need to have two versions, one that's all white, one that's random luminance. Do the bevels on the all white one, multiply the random luminance over. That stuff is really annoying. It's easier to have it all in just one easy place. So as an example, what I would do in this situation is not give these random luminance, or sorry, give them random luminance, use the square so that they're just all touching each other. I would run an edge detect to get the width of the grout, almost like the space between the tiles. I bevel this. And then I'll use this guy as my flood fill. Right, so we're going to do it here on him. So I'm going to bevel this out. And a trick with your bevel is just to set it to full. Run an auto level to bring that range back. And what's cool about this is I can just set my edge width with the tile randoms scale attribute. And it will just increase the width of our grout. And because our bevel is just set to full, it always just follows, which is really, really nice. Right? You don't have to worry about, anytime you can avoid hopping from one node to the other, correcting the thing you just made happen, the better. Just try to have it all flow logically back to front. So let's say we like this. We can do all sorts of fun stuff with the flood fill now in order to give this more interesting height map. So I'm going to delete these guys, run our flood fill from here. And what I can do, this would be random height, right? We're just doing it after the tile generator. So you could just multiply this down. The issue with doing this, maybe we don't want it on full strength. The issue with doing it this way is we get these smears. And that's just because we have all these black gaps in between all of our random grayscale islands, which hurts, right? That's not very good. So the best way to close these gaps up is with something called a distance. So this distance node is just going to take the inputted pixels and extend them until they reach the nearest white value of the mask input texture. So if I plug this into, well, what we should do, I'm going to plug this guy into mask input, and you can just see it's almost just like a bevel. As I move this up, the pixels are just going to extend from the original drawing, the original pattern rather, and they're just going to bleed out until they hit each other. And you can extend this all the way. This is just like the bevel, really, and cheaper. Sometimes the distance is just a better option. We do lose that color, the per tile random grayscale. However, if you plug this into source, we inherit it. And we can just put this distance to full. Only source is probably a good way to be safe about this. And now we have a fully flooded area, right? Where those values extend until they meet in the middle, which is great. Because now when we multiply this over, we don't have that annoying gap. And this is really cool. We have varying height on our tiles that occur after the tile generator, right? Anytime you can do this stuff out of sequence is really helpful, because oftentimes there's things you want to do in between the tile generation and the height variation that you wouldn't be able to do on just the tile generator. This is a use for Floodfill. There's so many. This thing is, like I mentioned in the intro, one of the most powerful node packages in the graph, in Substance for sure. So that's Floodfill to random grayscale. Again, lots of other uses for it. But we could go something like Floodfill to gradient. And this guy we can use it just puts a gradient in each island, which isn't normalized, which can drive me a little nuts. We can go over that some other video. But we can just put some random rotation on this. And now we would need that distance again, right? And the order of operations is plug whatever went into the flood fill should also go into the distance as mask input. And this goes into source, set to only source and full strength. And now we have that gradient. And if we multiply this over, now we have random slopes on all of our tiles. Right, so they're all kind of pivoting in a different direction, as if you modeled these in Maya or ZBrush or something, and you're giving them all some random rotation to differentiate them. Really, really nice. We can also kind of daisy chain these together by making it not as strong on every tile. Right now, each tile is uniformly bent. But we could take another flood fill to random grayscale and then use this, right? We can just get another seed of the random grayscale and use this as a mask so that our gradient isn't as strong on every tile. Some are much less tilted than others, right? This one is pretty flat. This one's really tilted. Very, very cool. So that's those. Again, I use these basically everywhere. Another thing you can use the flood fill to random gradient for is to create cuts. So if I had the same thing, so I just duplicated that, and I'm going to get another seed. I can do something like histogram scan these really high, right? So I just have the black at the edge, and I can set these to something like min to get some cuts on the edge. Now, you probably don't want to do that at this point, right? This is an important note about just like the sequencing you do this in, right? Because remember, the min blending mode is picking the darker of the two values between this and this. But we probably don't want to do these cuts after all of this stuff has been done, right? Because cuts will naturally be weaker on tiles that are already darker, right? Because the min value isn't as dark as the tile value or the value of the cut. So you probably want to put something like this first, right? Before you even do the random height. So I would just reorder this so that we go here, we do our min cuts first, and then we reorder those. So we get those nice cool cuts on the corner, which is really nice. One thing you'll notice that we probably want to fix as well is in here, the gradient doesn't really make sense, right? We don't have a complete cut. And the reason for that is just because this gradient, you can see the difference here. It doesn't extend in the same way, that this value isn't carried all the way to the end. And that's because that distance is just carrying the pixel value from here all the way to there. So we don't actually have a gradient here. We do up until the point where the distance kicked in, and then it's just the same value, which gives you these weird results. What you can do to make this better is to fix this flood fill. The problem is that this black space in the flood fill is just too large, right? There's too big a gap. So we can shrink this. The only thing we'll do it this way for now. Later on, we'll do a trick to make this a bit better. But for the ease of the argument right now, let's just there's other ways of doing this. And I want to make a separate video on it because it's a bit more stuff. But for now, what I'll do is just make a version of this tile generator where the scale puts them really close to each other. And use that for the flood fill, as well as all of our masks. So that's much better. Now we get those cuts running much more to the corner. There is another way to make it even better. We'll do that in a separate video. This is just to give you an idea. So this is really cool. Looks nice. There's some other stuff too. You can do some cool stuff with the Floodfill random grayscale we'll touch on later in this kind of impact cratering video I want to do. But you can also use this when it comes to albedo. So we have a Floodfill to color and we have a Floodfill to random color. The difference between those, so you have the Floodfill to grayscale and you also have Floodfill to random grayscale. So we're using these Floodfill to random grayscales everywhere. But you can also use Floodfill to just grayscale. And what this guy is instead of it being a random grayscale, he will take the value of the image you input. Right? So the center of these tiles are basically sampling whatever color is underneath them and then flooding that whole island that color. Right? It's really obvious if you plug something like a gradient in. The top tiles are going to get white, the bottom tiles are going to get black. Really, really cool. We'll do some fun stuff with that one in a different video. Floodfill to color is the same. If we had a gradient that was a rainbow, so I'm just going to quickly remap this to a rainbow off screen. We plug that in. We get our purple tiles up top, our orange tiles at the bottom. Just following this. Super sweet. We'll do stuff with that guy later. But Floodfill to random color and random grayscale are also really good. Floodfill to random color, we would go here. Just gives you a random color value. This is actually useful for a lot of stuff other than just albedo, to be honest, which we'll get into. But you could just easily, let's turn this into color. We don't like to blend color and grayscale, so we'll do this. And I'm just going to tint these all by our random color. So I'll set this to something like soft light. I like soft light for color blends like this. So each tile has some random color now. Now obviously it's a little clown mappy right now, but you can make this way better. You can also run a Floodfill gradient, like a Floodfill to random color, or random grayscale rather. So let's actually just grab one from earlier. So instead of doing this one, what you could do is just get a random grayscale, run this through a gradient map, right, which allows you to remap it to colors. And I'll just pick like the purple to blue spectrum. And now we have a bit more control over what the colors are. You could run that gradient map over a piece of reference, or you can pick out the colors you want manually, which I like to do. I'd rather know exactly what colors I'm going to use. But this is a good way of spreading those random colors around per tile. So we'll leave this here. Kind of cyberpunk stone floor. There we go. Let's make that a bit more intense. Cool. So those are the real main ones I want to talk about in this video. The last two I'll do is the Floodfill to bounding box size. Love this. So this is just coloring them a brighter value the bigger they are, and a darker value the smaller they are. This is really useful because oftentimes if you have a small, like if you're doing this to spread pebbles, let's say, you probably want the small pebble to also be short. So running something like this after you spread out your pebbles is really great. Right? As an example, if we have a tile sampler and we make our pebbles, or use our disks. Now you can control this in just the tile generator as well, but again, I like to do it after the fact. So we turn these up, mask random, put some scale random on them. We would want these small tiles to be darker than the brighter ones. Now, like I said, you can do that here, right on the sampler, by going to color, turning this guy up, and basing it on scale. So the darker ones get darker, the whiter ones get brighter. But again, there's lots of times just because of the sequencing, you would rather do this after the generator and keep the generator all white. In which case it's perfect. You just run a Floodfill, go Floodfill to bounding box size. I would want to normalize these because they're all just so small right now that they're all getting so dark. And there you go. Our small ones are shorter, our bigger ones are taller. This is really useful. So this will just give us, and again, we should normalize this. So we'll use our distance again, just to close that gap. And again, just to show you, we want whatever went into the flood fill to go into mask, and our flood fill 2 node to go into source. And we just set our max distance to full, only source. And then I would auto level this just to make sure I have white and black. And you'll see it makes our smallest tiles darker, which is really cool because what I'm going to do here is turn my random grayscale down a bit. That's the random height. And instead, I'm going to rely much more on the size of the tile to drive how small they are. Like how short they are, rather. Like this. Right, so the bigger tiles stay higher. It's good stuff. The other thing that's interesting about the flood fill to bounding box size is you can switch. Right now, it's looking at a combination of how big they are in X and Y. But you can say just how big they are in X, or just how big they are in Y. Right, so you can see a really good example of this is, these guys are just generally the smallest tile. Right, like this one is, because it's black. But if we compare them by just their X value, right, how wide they are, this is going to be the same value as this. This and this are the same value, because even though this one's smaller, they're the same width. You can do it with Y too, right? Even though these guys have the same width, this one's much shorter, so he gets shaded darker. This is just a combination of both of them. And so it's up to you to determine which one you're going to need for the situation, but you have options. You can also use this to single out elements, which we'll get into a later video, and it's really helpful. The last one we'll do, and I'm going to do a whole video on this one, is flood filled mapper. This one deserves a whole video because you can do all sorts of great stuff with this. But essentially, you're going to use a bounding box and then apply a shape. So let's say we add like a cool pattern. We use a histogram select and just make like a Cheerio essentially, or Fruit Loop, whatever your preference is. Fruit Loop if it's me, I guess. Plug that into pattern input, and this guy's going to spread that pattern into each tile, which is super awesome. You'll use this a lot too. Again, we'll need to get into a whole video for this because you would probably want this, but you'll get some stretching, so you'll probably want to fit it to the smallest shape and scale it up. There's all sorts of things you'd want to do to make this work for the specific thing you're interested in. And I'm just going to screen that and add this little pattern to the center of all of them. Really neat, right? And you can do things like give it some rotation random, won't matter here, but you can give them some positional offsets, like randomly, so they're not all in the exact middle. You can give them luminance random. There's all sorts of fun stuff that you'd expect to just see in a tile generator here. But really, that should be enough to get you sort of started with flood fill. Like I said, I have a bunch of different videos coming up that rely on this information in order to make sense of what we're going to do in them. I think this thing is really powerful. I really do prefer the sequencing of doing all your tile generation, doing your bevels, and then running all of your flood fills to do all of your cuts and slices and random angles and random heights, bounding box heights, stuff like that. It's definitely the preferred way I work. It's not the way I work 100% of the time, because sometimes there's exceptions, as there is to everything in Substance Designer. But I hope that's helpful. I'll post this graph in the description so that everyone can pull this up and just look through what I did for reference. Again, just thank you for watching if you made it all the way to the end. A lot of people make it all the way to the end, which is cool. I'm looking at the analytics, and a lot of people watch the whole video, which I'm shocked by because this stuff can be very dry. So I really appreciate that. If you're finding it helpful, a like is really awesome. A subscribe is astounding. Very excellent if you can subscribe. I really appreciate it. It gives me the energy to kind of keep going doing these things. As I mentioned at the end of every video, I have a big old list of this stuff, and I really hope to get to all of it. So thanks for all that, and we will see you guys soon.